Because of the new surplus of males, the label Rapariga, village prostitute, had lost most of its salience as a social category. This ran counter to a trend in Arambepe toward more social divisions and greater social complexity. Several factors had produced new divisions in this once homogeneous community. For example, people who had moved to Coronas and Volta do Robelo were no longer considered to be Arambeperos. Occupational diversity also meant different activities and associations for villagers, and many kinds of outsiders played roles in local life. The process of social change in Arambepe provides clues about the means by which any egalitarian or simply ranked society is transformed into a stratified social order. Not just in Arambepe, but more generally during such a process of socio-culture evolution, attributes that once were associated with particular individuals come to be considered markers of different social groups. For example, during the 1960s, a handful of villagers had had psychological problems. They were classificatory oddities. Other villagers didn't know what to make of them, how to explain their behavior. During the 1960s, the role of mentally ill person was undeveloped. By contrast, the mentally ill had become a salient social category with characteristic generalized behavior by 1980. In the realm of religious expertise, too, the idiosyncratic perceptions and special talents of individuals had found no social reinforcement in the old Arambepe. By 1980, they had. For example, no one cared in 1965 that one woman claimed to be able to discern in dark corners faces that others missed and to receive spirit possessors. A niche for her and others with similar talents had opened up in Candomblé by 1980. Another individual trait that had evolved in social category by 1980 is linked closely to the development of socioeconomic stratification out of hierarchy of graduated wealth contrast. Although they were relatively wealthy Arambeperos in the mid-1960s, villagers had always insisted that no one in the community was really rich. By 1980, by contrast, rich people had also become a salient social label. Arambeperos used the term bourgeois to describe wealthy people, including some fellow villagers. Alberto said that a bourgeois is someone who makes more than 50,000 cruzeros, about $850 per month. He assigned some boat owners and, somewhat jokingly, one Tibris worker to this category. Although many people, including Alberto, appeared to be more comfortable with success than they had been in 1973, others were wary of the rapidly broadening wealth differentials. One man complained, "There are so many rich people here now that it scares you." Two characteristic statements of the old Arambepe, "We're all relatives here and we are all equal here," were no longer heard. Immigrants, tourists, summer people, and hippies were certainly not relatives of native-born Arambeperos. Men like Dino and a few others who carried purses and owned cars and large boats were clearly not the equals of ordinary fishermen. The huge income gap between boat owner and crew member, a relationship at the heart of the traditional economy, was particularly impressive to villagers. It led some of them to exaggerate owners' profits and local wealth contrast. Alberto, usually accurate in his estimates, told me that rich boat owners would gross 100,000 to 200,000 cruzeros. That's $1,700 to $3,400 per day from their fishing interests. I told Alberto those figures were impossibly high. After we had figured out the actual profits, he saw his error. Still, his mistake is indicative of villagers' heightened perception of local wealth differences. Since there had been too little time for such wealth contrast to be transmitted across the generations, some familiar themes continued in local explanations for success. People still cited luck as a major factor in economic ascent and decline, especially in fishing. Through a series of minor incidents, luck could erode, as Alberto put it. Someone loads up his boat with ice, leaves port, and the motor breaks down. He loses all his ice and that day's or week's fishing. This happened to Tome, who then started fishing in his other boat, only to have the same thing happen a few weeks later. While Tome's luck was declining, that of his younger brother Dino was rising. said Alberto. Villagers were right. Luck, chance more accurately, along with the entrepreneurial activity, did still contribute to success. Certainly, as we shall see in Chapter 11, Tomei had been mistaken to overextend himself financially and rely too much on external resources. He was just as definitely unlucky to lose both his motors at the same time. Boat owners wouldn't have become as wealthy had there been no fishermen from Soape to replace natives who had qualms about having non-fishing co-villagers as their bosses, and besides could find more lucrative work on land. Even the business success of Alberto and Carolina rested as much on luck as on their hard work, foresight, and innovation. They were among the first villagers to electrify their homes. This allowed them to buy a reliable refrigerator and freezer and sell cold beer. But they had controlled neither the arrival of electricity nor the harbor shift that enhanced their view and made their bar especially attractive to outsiders. Use of such terms as bourgeois and ricos, rich people, suggests that consciousness of local class differences was developing, but villagers still defended Arembepe's social integrity. Many projected their hostility toward the rich against outsiders. One Friday afternoon, as boats returned, I saw a small man clutching a purse near the fish weighing station. Alberto identified him as a fish buyer from Atapuan. A gunman's going to come and take that purse away from him, suggested Alberto, but that assailant would surely not be an Arembepero. The man who said that rich people scared him also focused on outsiders. Just one local boy was recognized as having gone astray. First he became a marijuana-smoking hippie, and then a vagabond and a thief. Still, he had left the village and thus become an outsider. Although the lifestyle contrast they saw each day made villagers envious of each other, they projected onto outsiders their unconscious wish to level wealth. Strangers, not natives, would be the poor who robbed from the rich. Both in 1973 and in 1980, I found the local fear of robbers way out of proportion to reality, especially since, remarkably, no Arembepero had ever been robbed or assaulted by a gunman. The only armed robbery that had taken place locally involved outsiders. A couple emerging from Aunt Dolly's juice bar one Sunday was accosted by a gunman. He demanded their car keys and drove off, leaving them stranded. The only other incident in the past several years was even milder. Some Sunday visitors in the beach home area south of Arembepe had their trunk pried open and their money and documents taken. Arembepe in the 1980s still lacked law enforcement. The local policeman was feebler than ever. Outside officers came from time to time, for example, in June 1980 as part of a widespread search for a man who had raped, robbed, and murdered in a suburb of Salvador. He was later caught near Atapuan. Given actual happenings in Arembepe, I was 100 times more likely to be possessed by a spirit than to be robbed. Still, my old friends reiterated the warning, don't give rides to anyone. Beware, they said, of men who dress as women and hitch rides with the intent to rob. Alberto insisted I park my car in front of his house or near that of an acquaintance so someone could watch it. In the old days, reported Aunt Dahlia, no one locked their doors. Now everyone does, even when they walk across the street. I think that one reason for the exaggerated fear of robbers is this preoccupation with external threats provided an outlet for envious wishes toward co-villagers. Part of Foster's image of limited good is that wealth differences are allowed if they come from outside the community. In Arembepe, almost all of the wealth generated since 1970 had come from outside, from tourists, hippies, summer people, factory jobs, and the cheap labor of immigrant fishermen. This may be the main reason why, even in a village with a history of egalitarian and leveling mechanisms, the envy associated with emerging class consciousness was still projected onto outsiders. The fear of robbers may also have expressed resentment against outsiders for the radical changes in local life. There was another reason for local fears. My 1980s visits to Rio de Janeiro, conversations with urban Brazilians, perusal of newspapers and television newscasts all convinced me that most Brazilians were more worried about crime than before. It was unclear whether it was actual crime or mainly media attention to it that had increased. Whatever the reason, villagers could share the national concern with crime through their exposure to the mass media. While fearing outsiders, Arembeperos remained fairly tolerant of unusual behavior by co-villagers. No definite social sanction had been applied to the wealthiest boat owners. Disapproval of village prostitutes had abated as most of the women who had once bore that label established unions with immigrants. There was more alcoholism than ever. Villagers had always recognized that certain people drank too much. They used the term bebado, drunk, for people whose alcoholism kept them from holding steady jobs. By 1980, membership in the category had swollen. The new weekend drinking pattern was turning many fishermen into alcoholics. Constant drunks seemed to be everywhere in 1980. They wandered around seeking odd jobs and doles to buy another drink. It was almost impossible for me to avoid them when walking in Arambepe, even on weekdays. Villagers were starting to see the alcoholic as a social category with a characteristic role behavior, instead of viewing excessive drinking as simply an idiosyncratic problem for a few individuals. Local theories about alcoholism were just developing. Some villagers saw alcoholism as an illness, but most viewed it as a character flaw, which alcoholics could repair if they wanted. Alberto reported that a few people started buying cachaca from him at 5 a.m. and were drunk by 10 a.m. One of them was a jobless loner who said Alberto was waiting to die. Alberto considered this old man and the other constant drunks reprehensible. There was no stigma attached to heavy weekend drinking, and those who did it, including some captain owners, fishermen, and business people, weren't labeled alcoholics, though many would have been in the United States. Arambeperos believed that character defects, including alcoholism, could run in families. There were several sets of alcoholic brothers and at least one mother-daughter pair of heavy drinkers. Alcoholism was also linked to participation in candomblé, which is described in the final section of this chapter. Mental illness also seemed to run in families. Villagers regarded two middle-aged brothers as mentally ill. One had a monthly disability stipend through his former factory job. He checked himself in and out of a mental health facility in Salvador as needed. His older brother, never institutionalized, was a recluse who paced constantly indoors and talked to himself. Villagers also blamed the uneven behavior of their sister and the psychological problems of one of her sons on the family history of mental problems. Many mental problems were traced to the mother's death or to childbirth. The wife of one captain owner went crazy after the birth of her first child during the 1960s. She had recuperated and was considered normal in 1980. The mental and alcohol-related problems of two of Alberto's nephews started soon after their mother's death. The most dramatic local case of mental illness was that of Julia, a hippie-like young villager with a penchant for nudity. We met Julia the first day we entered Arambepe in 1980. As we ate lunch in Claudia's restaurant, we were startled to see an almost naked woman saunter up to the window. At first I suspected this young woman, whose head was shaved and body painted orange, might be an international IPA, who had been misinformed that a photography team from National Geographic was in town. Instead, she was a local girl who had become mentally disturbed in adolescence after her mother's death. Julia had been institutionalized several times, including once during our stay. She always managed to talk her way out during periods of rationality. Back in Arambepe, she would revert to deviance. Julia had burned her father's identity papers and entered some homes and destroyed possessions. Her most common expression of deviance was nudity, which flouted Arambepe's double standard for male and female dress. Although villagers considered an unclothed female much more offensive than a naked male, they were used to Julia's behavior. No one appeared to notice her each day as she drifted through the main part of town, clothed in a skimpy towel or less. Normal until adolescence, after her mother's death in 1975, Julia began removing her clothes in her home. At first occasionally, and then after the birth of her baby, often. Villagers told me that a totally naked Julia used to carry the baby around Arambepe. Birth and death can engender feelings of inadequacy and guilt in Arambepe as elsewhere. Indeed, we shall see that imaginary drawn from kinship and reproduction was important in candomblé, to which many insecure and potentially deviant people gravitated. The burden of guilt fell heavily on twins. Twin births were common in Arambepe, but few twins survived as a set. Surviving twins were especially likely to have psychological problems, probably expressing their irrational feelings of responsibility for their twin's death. For example, Alberto's daughter, a surviving twin whose spirit possession was described in Chapter 6, had a history of mild mental disturbance. She found solace in candomblé with its prominent sets of spirit twins. Her uncle, also a surviving twin, was Arambepe's highest-ranking candomblé member. Another twin was an authentic lunatic. When the moon was full, he started fighting with people and threatening to kill them. Other times he was normal and had a regular place and a fishing crew.